The Constitutional Court is due to hand down judgment today in a case which may hold implications for the voters' roll ahead of the municipal elections. The urgent application was brought by the Independent Electoral Commission after the Electoral Court set aside the voters' roll for the by-elections in the Tlokwe municipality. The IEC argued that should the judgment stand, the local government elections would not be able to go ahead because it could not provide addresses for millions of voters who were registered but whose addresses were not on the IEC system. Now let's go over to Eben, who has more on the story.
Yeah, Rena, be a landmark judgment. Very good morning to you if you've just joined us. Now, of course, for more on this landmark judgment, we will cross to our reporter now, Aldrin Samper. He's at the Constitutional Court tracking the story for us. A very good morning to you, Aldrin.
Good morning, Eben.
It's really D-Day for the case. Looking back at it, how do you view today, and also what is your expectation?
Well, it's definitely D-Day in terms of this Constitutional Court ruling. As you know, that the IEC has been seeking clarity around a previous ruling by the Constitutional Court around the same matter, around the Tlokwe matter. Remember that last year it was the independent candidates who came to the Constitutional Court contesting the Electoral Court's previous ruling that endorsed the by-elections that took place in Tlokwe back in 2013. Well, the Constitutional Court back last year ruled that actually those elections were not free and fair because the voters' roll was not in order, and that's the reason that we're back here, because the IEC had set up the elections, the by-elections again. They set it down for February earlier this year, but the independent candidates again went to the Electoral Court arguing that the voters' roll again is not in order and does not meet the constitutional master or does not comply with this Constitutional Court ruling. So the IEC then decided to come here to the Constitutional Court to seek clarity around that ruling. And if you remember that court ruling by the Constitutional Court, the Constitutional Court said there should be sufficient particularities. Now the question is, what does sufficient particularities mean? And I remember back earlier this year as well, when the IEC had a press briefing and the chairperson, Glenn Mashinini, asked what happens in a case where you have a South African who obviously has every right to go and vote, but who lives on the street. That person doesn't have a formal address. What does that mean? Does it mean that that person should not go ahead and vote? And that's the clarity that they've been seeking here from the Constitutional Court. And today is definitely that day that we'll get some clarity around this. And I guess this will also put the lid on any other litigation that would come against the IEC for having used since 2003 a voters' roll that's not in order.
Now, Aldrin, let's just look at a worst-case scenario quickly, because there's been a lot of different stories and leads and speculation within the media. What would a worst-case scenario mean or look like for the election on August the 3rd?
Well, the worst-case scenario would be that the Constitutional Court ruled that actually the elections can't go ahead because the voters' roll is not in order. It does not meet the constitutional master, because remember that the ANC as well, which was a friend of the court, argued that if you have 65% of South Africans who do not have formal addresses not being barred from participating in these elections, that will be unconstitutional. So the Constitutional Court could say, listen, let's rather than postpone the elections. And if you do postpone the elections, for how long do you postpone the elections? And remember that the IEC said it would need up until 2020 to get the voters' roll in order, which would then also mean that even the 2019 elections would then be affected. But if you listen back to the arguments that were led in court, and the question that came from Justice Mogoeng, Chief Justice Mogoeng, was that why was it possible for instance, for census, for the statistician to get all the addresses of all different South Africans and all those other foreign nationals who live in the country, and it's so difficult for the IEC. So we might have a situation where the elections have to be postponed, but you see a collaboration between the IEC as well as the statistician general around getting the addresses of all South Africans and all those who are eligible to vote. And the other problem is that the elections have already been proclaimed by the Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, so that might have to stand down. That would be the worst worst case scenario. Another case could be that the elections go ahead. But then if the elections go ahead, what would other political parties think about this? Because remember that the reason why they've been asking that the voters' roll be in order is to avoid vote rigging, to avoid people being bussed into districts where they do not live in.
So there's a certain amount of pressure, if one can call it that, within within this sort of pressure cooker situation that's building up to the election. But just tell us quickly about procedures today. How will this matter proceed, and who have you seen around the Constitutional Court so far?
Well, quite weirdly, I was actually expecting a lot more people around here, considering how important this case is for the country. It will affect the elections, of course, and you know that the elections speak to the democracy that South Africa enjoys. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of people out here. But today's proceedings are expected to be quite short. Normally, with these Constitutional Court judgments, they start around about 10 o'clock, and within an hour or so, the summary judgment would then have been handed down. But during the Nkandla matter, when the Constitutional Court handed down judgment there, we saw the judgment go on for a couple of hours.
Aldrin, thank you very much for that update. We'll be live with Aldrin a little bit later. He's at the Constitutional Court. We'll be inside the Constitutional Court as well today. Of course, don't forget Oscar Pistorius. That court case continues. Evidence and mitigation